Okay, so this is chapter 14, the nervous system tissue. So this is an introduction to the nervous system. The last 3 chapters of this unit will go through the nervous system and then the special senses, which are your ears and eyes. So we'll just start talking about nervous system tissue first of all. So here's our outline, and actually I should have shared this screen right away. I'm going to share we'll watch this YouTube video together. It's just a quick video. Can you guys see the YouTube video?
The nervous system is the control center of the human body. It is highly sophisticated, enabling the body to perceive, interpret, and respond to changes in its environment, while also facilitating cognitive processes such as learning, memory, and language. The nervous system controls voluntary processes, including the action of skeletal muscles, and involuntary processes, including circulation, respiration, and digestion. The nervous system can be divided both structurally and functionally. Structurally, the nervous system can be divided into the central and peripheral nervous systems. The central nervous system, CNS, comprises the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system, PNS, comprises all the nervous structures outside the CNS. The peripheral nervous system includes the cranial nerves, spinal nerves, sympathetic trunk, and splanchnic nerves. The peripheral nervous system connects the central nervous system to muscles, organs, and sensory receptors.
All right, so hopefully you guys could all see that. We'll get back to the PowerPoint now. Hopefully you can see this here. So your nervous system can be divided structurally or functionally. Structurally, we divide it between the central and peripheral nervous systems, and we'll talk about what those two are. And then the functional divisions, we divide it between the sensory and motor nervous systems. The sensory division is the division of the nervous system that senses external stimuli, and the motor nervous system will be the part of the nervous system that controls any sort of response to the stimuli. Here we go. So structurally, the nervous system has these 2 subdivisions. Your central nervous system, which is your answer to number 1 in your notes, is made up of your brain and spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system includes all of your cranial nerves, which come out of the brain, and the medulla oblongata, and then your spinal nerves, which come off the spine. The peripheral nerves will be then extensions of your spinal nerves, and all of the ganglia, which are like kind of enlarged pieces of nerves that include the cell bodies of the neurons themselves. So here we have the central nervous system. You can see there the brain and spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system, I guess, is the answer to number 2 in your notes. That's made up of your cranial nerves, your spinal nerves, and then the ganglia, which are just clusters of cell bodies of neurons. And if you guys have questions as we're going through, just feel free to blurt them out or put them in the chat too. These are the functions of the nervous system. So it looks like this is your number 3. It collects information. It has different receptors throughout your peripheral nervous system. These receptors are in your eyes, your skin, your ears, your nose. They detect changes in the environment, and then they pass that information along to your brain or spinal cord in your central nervous system. Then your central nervous system, whether that's your brain or spinal cord, that'll determine the required response to the stimuli. And then it will initiate that response. The central nervous system will send impulses that the peripheral nervous system carries to all the effectors. And those effectors could be muscles, they could be glands to react to any sort of changes in the environment that it's sensing. Okay. The sensory nervous system then, this is your answer to number 4. It's also known as the afferent nervous system. So your sensory nervous system, we also call it the afferent or afferent, starting with an A. It receives sensory information from the receptors in your peripheral nervous system and then transmits them to the central nervous system. We divide it into 2 components, somatic sensory and visceral sensory. The word somatic always has to do with things felt at a conscious level. So these will be things like senses like touch, pain, pressure, vibration, proprioception, which is your body's ability to sense where its parts are in space to each other. Then your visceral sensory these are things that are below the conscious level, so things that you're not aware of. These will be impulses from your blood vessels and your viscera that your nervous system has to respond to. So let's say your aorta, or you have a major blood vessel that's expanding or increasing in pressure. That is a visceral sensory stimulus that'll send, hey, there's something going up with this aorta, it's getting bigger, or this major blood vessel is stretching, what should we do about it? So visceral sensory usually has to do with blood vessels. Viscera always has to do with organs. So think visceral organs inside your body, subconscious. And somatic sensory are all the general senses that are under conscious control or conscious sensation. Okay. Next slide then is your motor nervous system. So this is the answer to number 5. Your motor nervous system, we also call it the efferent with an E, efferent nervous system, and that's because it will be the effector part of the nervous system. So it will send impulses from your brain through your peripheral nervous system to your muscles and glands. So your motor nervous system is the efferent nervous system, and this will be the one that will controls the response to any sort of stimulus that your afferent or sensory nervous system perceives. It's also divided into 2 systems. The somatic motor is your voluntary motor system, and the autonomic motor is the involuntary motor system. The somatic motor, think of everything that has to do with your skeletal muscles. If you can remember somatic, skeletal muscles, SS. It conducts impulses that cause contractions of your skeletal muscles. So you guys are in control of your skeletal muscles, so this is a voluntary response. And then your autonomic motor, these are things that happen automatically or involuntarily. Oops, sorry about that. It conducts impulses. Sorry, there's something over my screen there that stimulates smooth and cardiac muscle as well as glands. So that's our autonomic motor nervous system. Okay, this is a great chart, just looking at both of the nervous systems and their general functions. There will be questions. I think I did put the study guide up for this 3rd lecture exam, but I'll have questions, about these 4 different types of nervous systems, the somatic sensory and visceral sensory. Again, those are inputs traveling to your brain that your nervous system detects from external stimuli. Somatic sensory have to do with your 5 senses. They're consciously perceived. Visceral sensory are not consciously perceived. And then your motor nervous system is the output. So what the brain tells your body to do in response to something. So your motor output, you guys can control that. Your skeletal muscles, that's somatic motor. And then the autonomic motor controls all of your cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. So understanding this chart will be important. Okay, there's 2 distinct cell types within the nervous system tissue, and this is the answer to number 8 in your notes, so we're going down a little bit, and we'll come back and answer 6 and 7. The 2 cells within the nervous system are neurons, which you are familiar with, and glial cells. The neurons are nerve cells. These are excitable cells that can initiate, transmit, and receive nerve impulses. And glial cells, they're non-excitable, so they can't transmit an electrical response. All they do is support and protect the neurons. And we'll be looking at different types of glial cells and learning what each one does. All right, so the neuron is the basic structural unit of the nervous system. It can conduct nerve impulses from one place to another. It has a high metabolic rate, so it can take in some sort of energy source and continue functioning. It has an extreme longevity, so it lasts a long time. It's non-mitotic, so it doesn't divide through mitosis. It's excitable, so it can carry an electrical signal, and it's conductive. It can send that signal down itself. Neurons vary in shape, but this is what most of them have. And I think we covered some of this in histology at the beginning of the semester. The cell body is known as the soma. That contains several organelles like the nucleus, mitochondria, and then free ribosomes and rough endoplasmic reticulum. And the cell body is what is responsible for receiving, integrating, and sending nerve impulses. And that's the answer to number 9 in your notes if you're following along. Number 9 asks for what part of the neuron is responsible for receiving, integrating, and sending nerve impulses, and that is the cell body. Okay. Then the dendrites are short processes that branch from the cell body. They receive signals and transfer them to the cell body. And an axon is what then transports impulses away from the cell body towards other cells. Neurons have either one axon coming up from the cell body or no axon at all. And there's a name for neurons without an axon and what they're called. The region where the axon connects to the cell body is called the axon hillock. These words, I don't ask you too much about, but you'll go into detail in physiology what happens at the axon hillock. That's where the nerve signal starts to be propagated. There's a series of physiological reactions that occur at the axon hillock. Other structures within the axons that you do need to know, terminal telodendria are the extensions at the end of the axon, and then specifically synaptic knobs. This is what you do need to know. This is your answer for number 6. Synaptic knobs are expanded regions at the tips of the telodendria. And I'll show you a picture of this. The telodendria are kind of the expansions of the axon. And then the synaptic knob is just where the axon ends or where the telodendria end. And I will show you this picture here. So you can see the axon hillock. The axon is coming down. It looks like it's covered with these marshmallow-like structures. Those are the myelin sheaths. Myelin sheaths help to conduct the nerve impulse signal more quickly. And they're covered with a cell called a neurolemmocyte. We'll talk about that. But down here at the end, when you see the axon dividing, we call these terminal arborizations, or also known as telodendria. And those divisions at the end of the axon end with these little synaptic knobs. And the synaptic knobs are little enlargements that contain neurotransmitter. And the neurotransmitter will usually get released from the synaptic knobs, get passed to another neuron, so that all of these neurons are connected and they send their signal from one neuron to the next, and they pass their signal down at the synaptic knob level. Okay. These are the parts of the neuron. Again, you guys should know where the synaptic knobs are located and what the cell body is for. Those are the 2 questions in your notes there. All right, functional classes of neurons. There's 3 types of neurons, and they are based on their direction the nerve impulse travels relative to the central nervous system. So you can have a sensory neuron or a sensory nerve cell, and that's part of the afferent division. That will transmit impulses about the stimuli from external sources, from sensory receptors to the central nervous system. And then the motor is your efferent neuron, part of the efferent nervous system, that will transmit impulses from your brain to the muscles or glands that they'll control. If you ever hear about an interneuron is just kind of a go-between. It's the third class of neuron. It retrieves, processes, and stores information, and it can communicate between sensory and motor neurons. All right, so then we get to neuroglial cells. They are also known as just glial cells. They protect and nourish neurons. They're found in both your central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord, and also your peripheral nervous system. They're smaller, they're more numerous. So if we were looking at a histological slide, we'd see a lot of glial cells and only a few neurons. Glial cells are capable of mitosis, and brain tumors are more likely to be derived from glial cells than neurons. That's why you'll hear of people having some sort of glioma, because that's a tumor of the glial cells. Really deadly. Usually if you get a brain tumor, you're like given at most maybe a year to live. Really sad. But we will finish now with looking at the 4 types of glial cells in the central nervous system, and then we'll move on to glial cells in the peripheral nervous system. And these kind of take us through the last couple of questions in your notes. Okay, so we'll look at astrocytes, ependymal cells, microglial cells, and oligodendrocytes. And again, we're in the central nervous system. These are cells that support nerve cells. So we're looking at cells in the brain and the spinal cord. So here's a look at the 4 types of glial cells. They're in bold. The microglial cell, the astrocyte, ependymal cell, and oligodendrocyte. The astrocyte is in green. It has kind of these feet that wrap around number 7. We're going to get back to number 7, Erin. Yeah. One of the glial cells will help us answer that question. No problem. So the astrocyte is in green, and it has these little feet extensions that wrap around capillaries. Ependymal cells are found kind of along the lining of the brain cavity because they'll help create cerebral spinal fluid. Oligodendrocytes are cells that wrap myelin around axons in the central nervous system. And the microglial cells are a part of kind of the immune response. They'll help to take or destroy any pathogens that might get in the brain. Okay, so we'll go through each of those individually here. This is a general cell type, appearance, and function of the different cell types that we're going to go over right now if you want to come back to this slide and study it later. But this gives you basically what we're going to go over right now with their functions and then each glial cell. Okay, so this is, we're going to look at sorry, I can't read the top of my screen because the astrocyte first. This is the most abundant glial cell in the central nervous system. So these are the astrocytes. They help form what we call the blood-brain barrier. They have their little perivascular feet that wrap around capillaries. So they form a barrier between the blood that's going through these capillaries and the brain tissue. So that's why we call it the blood-brain barrier. They regulate tissue fluid composition. They help regulate synaptic transmission. That means the signal transduction between neurons. They form a structural network, they replace damaged neurons, and they assist neuronal development. So number 11, what glial cell helps to form the blood-brain barrier? This would be the astrocyte. So that's number 11. This is what the astrocyte looks like. You can see how it provides some structural support to the neurons itself, but it has what we call perivascular feet, which wrap around blood capillaries. This forms a barrier between what's inside your blood and what's in the brain tissue. So if you have something harmful in your blood that's traveling throughout your body, these astrocytes form a barrier with their feet, and they try to not allow anything harmful from your blood to get into the brain tissue. Some things do get through the blood-brain barrier. One is nicotine and one is alcohol. So nicotine and alcohol can both get through the blood-brain barrier. rather quickly, as I'm sure some of us are aware of. I'm not right now because I'm pregnant, but the ependymal cells, I think that's what I have up here. I got to figure out how to hide one of my things I can see. So these are ependymal cells. They're ciliated cuboidal epithelial cells that line the ventricles of the brain and the central canal of the spinal cord. So here are, you can see these ependymal cells here. They produce and circulate cerebral spinal fluid, and they help form the choroid plexus. Cerebral spinal fluid is important. It helps to create buoyancy in the brain. It protects the brain. It maintains homeostasis of substances in the brain, and it helps to clear waste. So you have cerebral spinal fluid in your brain and then all throughout your spinal cord in the middle or in the central canal. And ependymal cells are what creates that. And that's the answer to number 14. What glial cell helps to circulate cerebrospinal fluid? And those are ependymal cells, if you're following along. Okay. Then we have microglial cells. These are small cells that move through the central nervous system, engulf any sort of debris or pathogens, and these help defend the body against pathogens. So this is kind of your brain's way of kind of eating up anything that could be bad or harming it. So this is the microglial cell, and this will be the answer to number 13. Microglial cell. And then we have the oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes, it's important to note that they are associated with the central nervous system only. And they wrap themselves around the axons like electrical tape wrapped around a wire. And they produce myelin, which is an insulator of electrical activity. So number 10, what glial cell myelinates and insulates axons within the central nervous system? That is oligodendrocytes. And again, oligodendrocytes are only a part of your brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system has its own type of glial cell that produces myelin. So these myelin sheaths are what the oligodendrocytes create, and myelin just acts as electrical tape. It wraps around the axons of the neurons to help the axons travel or help to send that signal along faster. I'm trying to think, number 7 then, and we'll get to this question, but in case I forget it, a nerve impulse. In number 7, this is saying a nerve impulse travels fastest along, what do you guys think, myelinated axons or unmyelinated axons? Myelinated axons, yep. And of a larger diameter, because it's larger, there's just more space for it to be sent through, and there will be more myelin wrapped around it. So number 7, the answer to that is they travel fastest along myelinated axons of a large diameter. Okay, and that brings us, yes, and we answered number 8, yeah, so I think we just have number 12. So then we'll look at the 2 types of glial cells found in the peripheral nervous system. Satellite cells are arranged around the neuron's cell body, and the neurolemmocytes wrap the neuron's axons in myelin. We'll go through those. So here are satellite cells. They help regulate fluid composition around the neuron cell body. They're important, but I'm not going to ask you too much about satellite cells. I will ask you though about neurolemmocytes. These are also called Schwann cells. And again, neurolemmocytes, they are associated with the peripheral nervous system only. So this is your answer to number 12. Neurolemmocytes are associated with peripheral nervous system axons only, and they do the same thing that the oligodendrocytes did in the central nervous system. They'll wrap an axon like electrical tape wraps a metal wire. They produce myelin, which is an insulator of electrical activity. And again, they're similar in structure and function to oligodendrocytes. So this is a look at the neurolemmocyte. Also, You'll see it named a Schwann cell in probably when you're studying for your lab exam, but it is a neurolemmocyte. You can see the neurofibril nodes are spaces in between the myelin sheaths, and then you'll notice each neurolemmocyte or each myelin kind of marshmallow with the axon coming out of it has a nucleus. And that nucleus just is coming from that neurolemmocyte cell. So that's just the nucleus of the neurolemmocyte. Okay, so So myelin, a little bit more about myelin. It affects the ability of neurons to conduct nerve impulses or action potentials. You'll learn about how that works in physiology. Myelination is the process of wrapping the axon with the myelin sheath, and then the glial cells involved are the neurolemmocytes or Schwann cells in peripheral nervous system and the oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system. And then this shows the answer to number 7 in your notes. A nerve impulse travels fastest along myelinated axons of a large diameter. So myelinated and large diameter. This is the process of how the neurolemmocytes wrap the myelin around the axon. It starts to wrap around a portion of the axon, and then it begins to wrap consecutive layers, kind of like lollipop layers around the axon itself. And you can see how these myelin sheaths and these layers start to build up. All right. So again, here are the two differences between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. I know I try to pound that into you guys, but you should know oligodendrocytes, central nervous system, neurolemmocytes, peripheral nervous system. They propagate impulses by what we call saltatory conduction. Saltar means to jump in Spanish, so there must be some Latin root there. But it's just an impulse will jump from one neurofibril node or space in between myelin to another. So the impulse will jump between those spaces, between those myelin sheaths. Unmyelinated, some axons are unmyelinated and they can still propagate their signal, but without the myelin, it doesn't go as fast. All right, sometimes the axons or your nerves can become damaged if you get cut or if you break a bone or any sort of thing that could damage a nerve. Damaged peripheral nervous system axons can regenerate if the cell is intact and a critical amount of the neurolemma remains. Regeneration just depends upon extent and damage. And the neurolemmocytes will also help play a role in regeneration of those axons. So here's just a look at axon regeneration. If trauma severs the axon of a nerve, you'll just see how it'll become sealed off, swollen, and parts of the myelin will continue to build up around that axon as the axon continues to reform. I won't ask you too many questions about axon regeneration, but just to show you what would happen in trauma if a nerve were to become severed. Okay, then we'll talk a little bit about nerve itself. I'm trying to think, I gotta remember where I'm going with this PowerPoint. I don't have a lot left in terms of slides, but we'll go a little more into depth about the nervous system, the nerves itself. So if we've looked at an axon, now we're gonna talk about a nerve. And when we learn the nerves in the body, a nerve is a cable-like bundle of parallel axons together. So that's what each nerve in your body is. It's just a bunch of axons bundled together. There's 3 types of connective tissue wrappings around the nerves, similar to the wrappings around muscle tissue. The endoneurium is around each individual axon, the perineurium is around each fascicle, and then the epineurium is around the entire nerve itself. So here we have a nerve itself, and you can see the bundles of axons. The endoneurium will be around each individual axon, and then the axons will come together to form a fascicle, and the perineurium will wrap around each fascicle. Then bundles of fascicles will come together, and the epineurium will wrap around the entire nerve. Here's a histological view of a nerve itself, a cross section. You can see the fascicles, the axons, and then the layers around it. Here's another light microscopy look at a nerve itself. You can kind of see the myelin sheath surrounding each axon a little bit there. All right, so synapses then are specialized junctions between two neurons. A synapse will be any connection between a neuron and a muscle cell or a gland. And a typical synapse consists of the presynaptic neuron, which has the synaptic knobs at the ends for sending the signal. The synaptic cleft is the narrow space in between, and then the postsynaptic neuron will receive the signal. So your nerves or neurons will pass this signal down. It'll go to the synaptic ends, through the synaptic cleft, and then onto the postsynaptic neuron. Here is the direction of an impulse. You can see our axon here, the synapse, and whenever you hear the word synapse, that just means the place where one axon will send its signal to another nerve or nerve cell. And the synaptic knobs will be located at the ends of that axon and then send the signal to the dendrites or cell bodies of another neuron. We can have different types of connections or different types of synapses. They can be between axons and the soma or cell body. They can be between axons and dendrites, or they can be between axons and axons of another neuron. This takes you through a lot of the physiology, and I just want you to be aware of some of the terminology about this to get you prepped for physiology. Electrical signals involve gap junctions, and that just means a gap junction is a junction where ions can rapidly flow from one cell to another. Chemical signals involve the release of a neurotransmitter by the presynaptic cell. And I'm not going to go through all these steps, but you guys will learn these steps in physiology. Let's just look quickly at this picture. On the right, the chemical synapse. Here's the direction of the nerve impulse coming down to the synaptic knob. And within these little vesicles, they're carrying a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is just like the magical messenger that gets sent across the synaptic cleft to the postsynaptic neuron, and that will receive the neurotransmitter. And when it receives that neurotransmitter, it does some crazy things with sodium and other ion channels where they open them and the signal continues to flow down. Just to get you excited about physiology. Hopefully we'll be in person then. Okay, so this is just a look at an MRI showing a brain tumor. So a glioma is a brain tumor. Remember, glial cells are supporting cells in the nervous system. And normally when people have brain tumors, it's a tumor or conglomeration of glial cells. So there's a glioma there. I hope and pray none of you have to deal with that or any of your loved ones. Other disorders of the nervous system, you've probably heard of Stephen Hawking. He didn't die that many years ago, I don't think, 2, 3 now maybe. So he had ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which damaged parts of his nervous system. So he was completely paralyzed. He couldn't talk. So he had ALS, an extremely intelligent man. And then multiple sclerosis mainly affects women. Oh, Aaron, I'm sorry to hear that. 39 years old. Oh, okay. I know you guys, if you want to, you can take a look at that chat. Thanks for sharing, Aaron. I'm so sorry to hear that. Multiple sclerosis then is another disorder with the nervous system. It's a little more slow developing, and you can get, for some reason it affects women. It can affect women as early as in their 30s or 40s. It can be slow going. There's no real cure for multiple sclerosis. You just kind of have to manage the pain and deal with it. I think you can still live a long life, but it can just start to damage your nervous system. Your nerves wear down, so you start to lose kind of control or functionality of basic movements and walking. And I think the last one here, I know this is a little graphic, but this is a newborn born with anencephaly, where it's born with the brain outside of the skull. So obviously parts of the skull weren't completely forming to keep the brain intact. Obviously the lifespan for this would not be very long at all, but that's anencephaly, when the brain, your brain is outside the skull itself. Anencephaly you can see in an ultrasound. Just reading through the chats a little bit. So okay, so she had a brain tumor and she's still alive, Christina, okay. But she lost her short-term memory because she suffered a stroke during the surgery. Oh, wow. Yeah, oh, my good friend's mom died of a brain tumor. And yeah, it's so sudden and you can't control it at all. So you just never know. But this is anencephaly. You can see the absence of the cranium. So here are this little guy's 2 eyes, and above you can see how the cranium is not completely formed where the arrow is. So that would show that there would be an absence of cranium or skull bones around the brain. And then I think I have one more. Oh, spina bifida. This is probably one you've heard of, not more commonly, but maybe one you've heard of before. It's a neural tube disorder that occurs in 2 forms, spina bifida cystica and spina bifida occulta. So what spina bifida is, if you're looking at the picture in letter A, it's basically when the vertebral arch, so where your spinous process would form in your vertebra, that vertebral arch with your spinous process and the lamina, which I know I labeled, that was, never mind. The spinous process and the lamina do not completely form around your spinal cord going down your back. So instead of that vertebral arch forming, you might get a cyst filled with cerebral spinal fluid. That cyst can then come to the outside of the body, as you're seeing here on letter B, a child with spina bifida cystica, where the vertebral arch does not form at all, so it forms a cyst filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And then spina bifida occulta, I think with this one, this vertebral arch is still incomplete, but you at least get some sort of covering around the spinal cord, so you won't get a cyst filled with cerebral spinal fluid coming to the outside. For some reason though, there might be a tuft of hair shown there. I'm not sure why hair would grow there, but that could be a sign that there would be an incomplete vertebral arch with that too. So that's this chapter for chapter 14. So I'm just going to stop the recording here